Mr. Mervyn oversees a research team which focuses on the thematic and cross-sectoral ESG research using both internal and external data sets. Mr. Tang rejoined Fitch Ratings this year from MSCI, where he was the head of fixed income in the ESG research department, and he was based out of Hong Kong. Prior to his joining in MSCI, he was with Fitch as a director in the Sovereign Group in Asia Pacific. Before that, he's held positions in London as an economist with the Bank of England, and he's also worked as an equity analyst with the Citi Group. Mervyn has earned his master's in economics from the University of London and a bachelor's in economics and management from the Oxford University. Mervyn is also a CFA chartered holder. So thank you, Mervyn, for joining us today. My pleasure and honor to welcome you to this discussion.
Thank you. Very excited to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Mervyn. Last but not least, my pleasure to welcome Belinda Scott, and she is joining us from UAE. So Belinda is a vice president and the head of corporate sustainability at First Abu Dhabi Bank. She's responsible for developing and implementing the bank's corporate sustainability strategy and the roadmap for this. She has an oversight for the bank's sustainable finance and ESG performance reporting. She also acts as the sustainability advisor to the bank and its group business on the sustainability front. She represents FAB on several committees, including the UAE Climate Change and Environmental Council, the UAE Private Sector Advisory Council on Sustainable Development, and the ADGM Sustainable Finance Consultative Working Group, and also the World Future Energy Summit Technical Committee. She holds a postgraduate degree in sustainable business from the University of Cambridge and has also completed one of her sustainability certificates from the London Institute of Banking and Finance. So my pleasure to join, please join me in welcoming Belinda Scott to this webinar. Thank you, Bib.
To be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So with this brief introduction, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into this topic of discussion today. And I think this is one of the most pertinent and one of the most discussed topics all over the world in the domain of banking and finance. And let me just give you a quick brief as to why we've selected this topic in the first place. Why green and sustainable finance as a topic for discussion today? The objective is primarily to raise awareness about this topic, the opportunities in this domain, among the banking and finance community in UAE. So that's a primary objective for hosting this kind of a webinar. And often, we often see a lot of misconceptions around this theme of green and sustainability and all this. A lot of people mistake it for, some kind of a charity happening. So we really want to, remove those kind of misconceptions and tell people that it's really a solid business case. And we've got the experts all over the world joining us, to, help you understand this concept. And as Dr. Neil said, it's one of the most fancied and one of the most talked about buzzword in banking and finance, especially since, the COVID pandemic. But it's not a concept that, that emerged in 2020 or 21. It's something that's been long. So, it's something that's got a lot of attention recently. I think, as a finance researcher, the concept of triple bottom line is about profits, planet, and people. The three P's. It's not just about the last thing, which is the profit. It's also about planet and people. So that is a concept. It's a 25-year-old concept, which has actually evolved to a lot of interesting dimensions, and ESG is probably an extension of that. So in this conference, in this webinar for the next 1.5 hours, we are going to discuss whether green finance, sustainability, and all these dimensions, is it going to make real business sense for investors, for banks, and for everyone in general? Or, you can always play the devil's advocate, and I can always ask them, or is it just a fancy buzz, which probably will go off as COVID goes off? So these are all the things that we would like to discuss. We would have a conversation for almost 1.5 hours. So it's basically till 12:30. So we would continue a conversation for almost 1 hour, and we'd be happy to take your questions. If you have your questions, please ping it in the chat window, and our moderator would take it up for further discussions. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me just get into my discussion agenda. And let me start with the very first question. And since I have people joining from different banks, different backgrounds, different departments, I think it's fair on my part to start this entire discussion by asking the panelists to explain their perspectives about what exactly is green finance, what is it all about, what are the guiding principles behind green finance, and who are all the stakeholders in this entire, the gamut of green finance. So I think this is probably the right way for us to start this discussion, because a lot of people would be very new to this concept of green finance. So over to my panelists. Anyone can pick up. Mr. Simon, would you like to start, please?
Great. Well, thanks, Alan. Yeah, well, let me start with maybe a broad perspective, and then perhaps Belinda and Mervyn can come in too. I mean, I think in your opening remarks, sort of, Alan, you really hit the nail on the head in talking about the importance of thinking about how finance can serve, the triple bottom line of people, planet, and prosperity. This is really what we're getting to when we talk about green and sustainable finance. And I will talk a little bit about what we mean by green finance and sustainable finance, because the terms are often used interchangeably, and there are strong links between them. Generally, sustainable finance is the broader term, and in the context that we use it at the Chartered Banker Institute, and I think many others would use it, it generally refers to creating shared prosperity for everyone. And by everyone, we're talking about meeting the needs of current generations without, and this is the key point, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs too. So it's about meeting intergenerational needs, banking and finance for the long term. And that's really what we're talking about. Of course, when we then talk about what do we mean by the needs of current and future generations, those needs may be very wide and very varied. But most approaches to sustainability focus on three key aspects, often thought of in terms of a stool with three legs: the economy, the environment, and society, which was really first, I think, codified by the UN Brundtland Commission back in 1987, I think it was. So this is a long time ago now. But the economy, environment, and society, that's, I guess, the formal way of saying people, planet, and prosperity. Or you can think of it in terms of then the environmental, social, and governance factors to an extent in ESG. And personally, I think the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals provide the best framework for understanding and thinking about the wide scope of sustainability and sustainable finance. So they include climate change and environmental sustainability, which is often what we mean when we talk about green finance. But they also extend that to broader aspects of equality and inclusion, social sustainability, and social justice too. And they're hence the wider term sustainable finance. And more and more businesses, and especially financial institutions, are linking their strategies and activities to one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Principles for Responsible Banking, to which many institutions now are signatories, linked to the Sustainable Development Goals too. And then, of course, from 2015, with the Paris Agreement on climate change, policymakers, regulators, and financial services have focused in particular on environmental sustainability, particularly tackling global warming, although hopefully we'll get into the fact, environmental sustainability is not just about climate change. There are other wider factors too. And then that's what we tend to talk about when we're talking about green finance. It's the focus on environmental sustainability.
Thank you, Simon, for that. Mervyn and Belinda, would you like to add on?
Yes, absolutely. So Fitch, as a credit rating agency, we think about credit risk. And so I think just as a start to kind of explain the ESG integration process, when we do say ESG and sustainable finance, often the objectives can vary depending on who you're talking to. So some investors might be looking at ESG from how do we generate positive sustainable impact or avoid negative sustainable impact. Some are thinking about it purely from a risk return perspective, just that things that are happening from a sustainability perspective, for example, the introduction of policy, the changing behavior of consumers, all that can lead to a financial impact if ESG issues are ignored. And so you have really a spectrum of strategies and processes when it comes to financial institutions on how they actually deal with ESG. Now, when we say green finance, again, I think we can expand a little bit more, because you could have directing capital towards green and sustainable activities. But the flip side of that is avoiding having capital being directed to less green and less sustainable activities. And we're seeing processes and policies materializing for both sides. So maybe one example from the credit rating agency world or the credit rating world is we downgraded a Australian coal port terminal entity recently because of financing flexibility challenges that they face, because domestic banks, developed market banks started pulling away financing from them. And that really started exacerbating some financing challenges, because the way that the port structure was financed, it had a bullet amortization structure. So they needed to refinance debt in large amounts in a short period of time. And so when financial institutions started pulling away, that led to really just financing challenges faced by the entity. And so the reason why banks were doing that was, I think, both for concern in terms of due diligence process and screening of coal, avoiding reputation risk, as well as the potential risk that coal entities and coal assets might have in the world of tightening carbon policy. This actually it can be quite complicated, because if we look at, say, some emerging market banks that we also deal with, they are not actually doing the same set of policies. So when we look at, say, an SOE in Indonesia, even though they're much more directly exposed to coal, they may not face the same financing pressure, because they are kind of mainly reliant on government or state-owned bank funding. So when we from a risk perspective, or green finance from a risk perspective, some of the nuances can be kind of must be very carefully considered. And so Fitch on our side, in terms of a credit rating agency, is focused on what the financial transmission mechanisms are when it comes to these sustainability issues onto real world economic impacts.
Thank you, Mervyn. And I think it's a very interesting dimension that you brought on the table. I think we'll also hear from Belinda, a banker's perspective on how you look at the whole gamut of green and sustainability in brief. And, we'll discuss then in detail about each of this area, credit, investments and all that. Yes, Belinda, please.
Thank you. So if I use FAB as an example, we've been on a journey. So sustainability, when we first started looking at it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same as how we look at it now. And I think that this is something that in the region we're very aware of, is that you need to start looking at sustainability and how it affects the business that you're conducting. So when we look at sustainability, we look at what, first of all, is going on globally, and especially in things like climate and social issues, and how they potentially are being addressed by our government, what our government response is in terms of the region or the countries where we're doing business. And then we look at our sector and what our sector is doing. And then once we've got an understanding on that, we then start to look at how we want to respond and what is it that we can do as a bank to bring about change. And that's obviously based on using our strengths as a bank and what we want to finance in the future. So we look at opportunity, impact and risk. And it is very much about looking at the things that we also consider, our stakeholders consider are material and important, and what they want to see us focusing on as a bank. So we recently did a materiality assessment to sort of try and understand the sorts of things that our stakeholders are interested in, and then, how that feeds into not just the way that we're developing the sustainability strategy, which covers the ESG topics, but then what those opportunities can be. So we found that, you know, responsible lending and investing, when we did that materiality assessment a couple of years ago, was number 6 on the out of the top 10 important materiality issues. But actually now it's about responsible lending and investing is now number 1. Stakeholders want to see us financing projects that actually, like Mervyn said, is about moving the finance towards doing good, or reducing not just risks, but moving finance to finance the things that have become more important, such as climate change, or if we're looking at social, it would be things around perhaps supporting the development of women. So although green is a very, very important part of the financing that we do, social is also very important. We issued a green bond. We were the first in the region to do so, but we've just actually updated our framework to include sustainability framework, so that it actually can include social aspects, and even if we wanted to look at blue, which is another growing issue around the health of the oceans, and how that could have considerable impact on societies. So it's sort of trying to work out those key issues that we need to finance, and to also then respond to investors who are also very interested in our exposure to some of the big global polluting organizations, and how eventually, it's not just about divesting those companies from our portfolio, but how do you actually transition them to a more responsible and more environmentally or socially responsible pathway, and to develop their business. Yeah.
Thank you, Belinda, for that. So I think we've got a very yes, Mr. Simon.
Just I think so hopefully the sort of our audience have got an idea that, you know, this is a very large area. You know, green finance isn't just one thing, and you know, I'm glad that Belinda highlighted the sort of social and the wider aspects of sustainability too. But, you know, if there's one thing that I think perhaps links all these areas, it's that whether it's the environment, whether it's sort of equality or other aspects of social sustainability, what we're trying to do in green finance is to price externalities that as finance and as the world in general, we simply, for, you know, since the Industrial Revolution, we haven't considered that they do impose a cost on society and ultimately on finance too. And so that's why a lot of effort at the policy level is going into things like carbon pricing now. And if we can sort of, you know, I think we're still a long way from it, but you know, if and when carbon is priced at a realistic, globally consistent level, then sort of picking up on sort of Mervyn's example of the coal port, which is a great one, then businesses like that face, you know, existential threats. And, you know, and we have to recognize it's not the fault of the people who run the coal port and coal mines and so on. You know, for 200 years we've relied on coal and fossil fuel powers. So that's where you get in these wider aspects of what's called the just transition. So how do we move from a high carbon a world very dependent on high carbon forms of production and distribution and power generation to low carbon, more sustainable alternatives, but taking people and communities with us. And that is a huge challenge, but that's also where the opportunity lies for the financial services sector. And it's really important we see this through the lens of both climate and environmental risk, but also the enormous opportunities that are there, both the commercial opportunities, and that's not just about investing in the next big green Tesla thing. It's also about helping every business with a high carbon model transition to a low carbon model, and every community that's reliant on high carbon power generation finance lower carbon generation too. So there's incredible opportunities for the financial services sector in green and sustainable finance.
Thank you, Simon, for that. So let me probably move ahead to the next I would probably call it the most important question in my entire discussion, and I'm sure it's at the back of most of your mind. So the big question here is, does it really make business sense, or is it just a fancied word that probably some people can afford to do it, or some countries can afford to do it? Or is there a real business sense behind this concept of sustainability and green finance and all this? Because just to set the floor for this question, the Equator Principles, which is often cited as one of the key benchmarks in project financing in banking, most of the banks in the developing economies and the emerging economies, they're very hesitant to sign the whole concept of Equator Principles, because they feel it restricts them from doing a lot of potential business, especially on high ticket project financing, which is very important for their economies. So at the end of the day, there's a growing perception that, whether green finance and sustainability finance, whether it really makes business sense. Can countries move away from traditional, investment avenues and lending avenues like, financing a coal port, as Mervyn just spoke about? So is it really something that really makes business sense? This is my question to my panelists. So I'd be happy to take answers from all of you. Thank you.
On that one first, we're signatories. FAB is a signatory to the Equator Principles, and our latest report is available actually on our website. But we haven't found that we've had to turn down any financing by using the Equator Principles. We've actually been able to work with companies the financing to sort of explain the sorts of things that we're looking at in terms of that require the loan or the financing to be compliant. And it's an opportunity to educate and to have those discussions and to raise the issues that are of concern. And I think that more increasingly what's happening is a lot of organizations are seeing that if they want to be provided finance now, they're going to have to meet the criteria, because this is just the EP is just one of the many requirements now. And it's interesting that you say that some banks are very nervous of signing it, but actually, if you look at the reason why the Equator Principles were actually developed, they were developed by a group of banks that were financing a project. I think there was a couple of projects. One of them was in China, which was the big dam project, and I think the other one was the Baku-Tbilisi pipeline. And the result from financing these was that there was going to be massive displacement of communities and significant environmental issues. And they were under so much pressure from NGOs and activist organizations. The damage to their reputation was significant that they withdrew the financing, and they came together to actually say, we need to have a framework that will protect us from this sort of thing in future. And that's where the Equator Principles came from. So it's used as a way of screening for your own financing as a bank, and it's also a way of educating your customers to actually make sure that they've got the right sort of things in place, that they're not causing damage environmentally or socially, and to sort of improve things. People say that the EP in fact don't go far enough, but they're under development as well all the time. And I don't think that any bank needs to be concerned about becoming a signatory.
Thank you. Mervyn, would you like to share some international perspectives about this?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it kind of goes back to Simon's point about a big part of sustainable finance is the recognition of externalities, be they environmental or social, suddenly materializing into the actual financial balance sheet and overall financial profile because of what's happening in regulation and behavioral changes and just a lot of things happening in the world. And so I think I think making a statement like, does green or sustainable finance make business sense? I think that's too general a statement because green and sustainable finance is so many things. But I think there's lots and lots of examples where green and sustainable financial issues are becoming more and more important from a financial perspective. So Simon already mentioned carbon pricing. So if we look at what's been happening in the EU emission trading scheme, we've seen carbon prices averaging 25 euros a ton in 2019, now up to over 50 euros and kind of and looking to increase. And so the fact that carbon prices are increasing means that it is making financial sense to consider what the potential costs are with carbon pricing increasing for high carbon business models. You're seeing that across the world. So China has launched, started trading on it. Well, they've started operation of the emission trading scheme this year. We've seen a whole lot of pilot emission trading schemes across the world. So then, but if we then go into kind of what Belinda mentioned with some of the lending projects and what happened with the societal disruptions and community disruptions, Fitch, we looked at really what's been happening to our credit assessments that have been impacted by ESG issues across our portfolio. And you see you see a large number of examples of this. So an operational disruption leads to a delay of a project because either a government responds to what its population is saying, or like a part of society being affected and go, okay, we're stopping this project, or we're putting additional fines and regulations on it. You've seen this with just how governments are dealing with things like oil spills or Vale's tailing dam incident. There's a lot more recognition of some of this environmental or societal damage that is being caused by business operations. You're seeing investors also paying more attention. And I think that's partly from a risk perspective, but also their own reputation. So when they are investing in something that's deemed to have negative environmental and social externalities, they are facing their own pressure, but they also recognize the risk that it can have on their portfolio and their investment returns. And so all these things are happening that is leading to which is what makes financial sense to assess these issues. Now, I don't think that means that every SDG is going to have the same financial sense, right? Because there's lots and lots of different transmission channels when it comes to regulation, financing flexibility, operational disruptions. Like all of these issues need to be considered with nuance, but it's clear that the world is changing in a way where some of these externalities that weren't captured before are now being captured.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So Simon, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to, I think Alan, you gave us two questions for this bit. One was kind of, does green finance make business sense and can we afford it? So let me step back a bit. So does it make business sense? Well, I think it does, because ultimately, if we have a planet that is uninhabitable, there is no business to be done. And that is what we are looking at. If you follow the science, and there is a extraordinary sort of scientific consensus on this, climate change is already having significant effects, and even if we achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement by mid-century, the world will still change significantly to mid-century, and for at least 50, perhaps 100 years beyond that, because this doesn't happen. Change doesn't happen quickly. And if you think of the effects of climate change on sectors like agriculture, Belinda mentioned the oceans earlier, access to water, displacement and migration. I mean, one of the figures that always sticks in my mind is that a global temperature increase of 2 degrees centigrade doesn't seem to many people like a huge amount. I mean, I live in Scotland. It'd be wonderful if Scotland was 2 degrees, even 10 degrees warmer every day of the year. I know it's not the case in the UAE, particularly this time of year. But the reality is that's a global average temperature increase. And even with 2 degrees of global warming, temperatures on land in areas such as sort of equatorial regions in particular will increase by possibly 4 or 6 degrees. Quite literally making some parts of the world, including parts very close to where many of you will be today, uninhabitable. So in other words, those are places where business cannot be done. So does it make business sense to do this? Absolutely. And that's before we get into geopolitical risk and issues around displacement and migration and health and so on too. And then from financial sense, we're looking at, whatever scenarios the world faces, we know there will be increasing physical risks. So rising sea levels, increasing severity and frequency of weather events, tropical storms and cyclones and so on, ever increasing droughts. That raises the costs not just to communities and businesses, but to all the institutions financing them. We have the transition risks that sort of Mervyn's talked about as well. So the cost of not doing anything continues to increase, and even if we do mitigate climate change, continues to increase. So we have to address it. Can we afford it? Absolutely. We know it costs. We know it'll cost about $6 trillion a year to solve the climate crisis. Estimates vary, but that's a fairly solid one. Extrapolate that over what sort of 20 years or so, we're looking at 120 trillion. The savings balances exist to fund that, mostly in areas like Southeast Asia. So actually all we need to, and also the good news is we have pretty much all the technologies we need to solve the climate crisis. We may not have them at scale, but we know what we need to do. We know how much it costs. We have the money. So we just need to do what banking and finance is supposed to do, which is connect savings with investable projects and save the world at the same time. So yes, absolutely, we can afford it. And then I thought, we introduced that really important point around the developing world and developing nations. And I think we should remember the moral aspect of this too, that it's very often those who are least responsible for climate change. So after all, it's primarily not just, but it's the industrialized Western world that has increased global temperatures to date. We don't necessarily face the greatest impacts from climate change. Those will be felt on many communities in the developing world, particularly coastal communities and countries in very hot parts of the world. And so there is, I think, a moral imperative to make sure that we address this as a global issue, and that those who are able to pay for the mitigation adaptation we need do pay for it.
Thank you, Simon, for that. I think it's been a very interesting discussion about this, and I think the essence is you need to think long term. You can't just think beyond your next year's profitability. You have to think long term, because if the world itself is not sustainable, there's no business that you can do in the future. So I think with this very nice discussion that we've had, I think let's move to the more specialized topics of our discussion. So first, let's look at banking. I think these are two big topics for us to do today's discussion. One is we need to look at the use cases of green sustainable financing in the banking domain. How can banks and finance institutions support the whole theme of sustainable and green finance in a very equitable as well as a profitable way? So that's something that we would like to explore. The second topic that we would like to discuss today is look at ESG investing as a theme. Green and sustainable investing. Does it really make sense again for an investor? Can he expect returns as an investor in the long term? So these are all the topics that we would like to discuss. So let me start with the banking use cases and the green banking, if I may call it. I've had a very nice question, and I would like to probably raise that question also here. So one of the questions is, everybody kind of now understands what green finance is, what is sustainable lending and social finance and everything. Now the question here is, how is it different in principle, in practice, from the traditional ways of financing when it comes to banking? So I think that's a very interesting question that would probably be able to help a lot of people to understand what exactly is green finance doing differently from what conventional financing is all about. What are those extra layers? What are those extra principles behind this? So we would like to hear from all our panelists about this. I think this time probably I can start with Mervyn and then move on. Thank you.
Yes, happy to. And I think it's a great question because there are parallels with traditional banking, depending on how you look at it. Because if we're talking about just the incorporation of risk and return, then it's the analysis in traditional banking should not be too much, not that much different. I think what's changed with green and sustainability issues from a risk perspective is the former short-term cash flow modeling, where you have a 2 or 3 year forecast and then you extrapolate for 10 years time, doesn't work very well anymore in a world with climate change, because climate change is something where we know that the risks on both the transition and the physical side is going to be increasing over the next decade and multiple decades. The question is how much. And so the traditional ways of modeling and analysis from a banking perspective, and again, still just talking about the risk return side, has to be changing. And that's what we've seen with regulators around the world with the introduction of things like climate. Is the former analysis in terms of your former modeling from a risk perspective is no longer sufficient, because the difficulty with analyzing climate change from a physical risk and a transition risk is you're not sure how regulation is going to shift and how policy is going to shift. Governments have pledged all sorts of pledges on net zero, Paris Agreement. But if we look at the actual policies that have been enacted, quite often the policies don't match what the pledges are. And so the question is, will the policies speed up in a way that these pledges are matched? Now, if policies do tighten significantly, it means that the transition risks that we face will be much higher, but the physical risks that would have otherwise happened would be lower. Whereas if governments just don't do anything, then the transition risk is not going to be as so. Oil will still be kind of freely traded, prices won't fall, whereas physical risk would be much higher, which I think Simon mentioned, and the potential impacts on various natural disaster and catastrophe-prone regions. Now, what we have seen with regulation coming through and initiatives like the TCFD is introduction of things like scenario analysis, the incorporation of climate risk into board governance and sustainability assessments. All of this is to try and change the traditional lending framework to incorporate the long-term risks and ESG risks that things like climate change could lead to and could materialize. That's the risk return part. We're also seeing regulation and changes at the impact part. So is what the bank doing having either positive impact or potentially negative impacts? And so one example of this, again, from the kind of regulatory space, is the EU's introduction of the green asset ratio, which means that more and more of what a bank's activities in terms of what they're lending and whether it's green or not and how much of their lending is green is now a number that is going to be quantified. And the reason why this sort of ratio is existing and the more and more developments of these metrics is that investors and other stakeholders are more and more interested in the sustainability impact of a bank's financing activities. And that's going to have a knock-on effect on how banks lend capital to each other, how investors give capital to banks, and just generally kind of how NGOs scrutinize the kind of different activities that a bank might be doing. Same with policy. The creation of things like green asset ratios would allow for government incentives if they're trying to reallocate capital from less sustainable to more sustainable activities, or even I think central bank policies. So we've already heard conversations about the ECB and others looking to use monetary policy tools as part of kind of direction of green finance activities. So a lot of things are happening that is leading to kind of the changing economics for banks when it comes to sustainable activities.
Thank you, Mervyn, for that. Belinda, if you can actually share the UAE experience about how probably a bank like FAB has changed its credit policies. Once the focus on sustainability has increased. So, what are the changes that you've had, especially when it comes to corporate financing and large ticket project financing? So we'd be happy to hear that perspective. You're muted. We can't hear you. Belinda, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, yeah.
There wasn't a problem there. Yeah, so on a practical level, there's several things that we're doing. We've established already an ESG risk function in the bank. So I think that this is part of the journey. Like I said before, we didn't have that, but my team worked directly with the credit team to include ESG screening within the credit policy for loans and different financial products. But now we have an ESG risk team that are actually developing the policies and the ESG risk framework for the bank. So that's a really big step forward. And we see, I think, from discussions that we've had with central bank that there'll be some movement towards voluntary requirements next year.
If I look at
the work that our CIB team do, as they develop the green products themselves, it's very much around writing the KPIs into the loan documentation or the deal documentation, and making sure that you can actually track the performance of those KPIs, which is then linked to the pricing. So I think that there's a lot that goes on internally in the practical side of it. We actually have somebody that is responsible for sustainable finance in CIB, and then on the other side we have in our treasury team we have a team that also are promoting private placements. But it is very much also about the screening and the due diligence part of when the financing starts, the process of screening the financing, the credit screening, the due diligence, but also inserting ESG into those processes. Excuse me, so that we can decide in respect of whether something can be used for if it has to comply with the Equator Principles, or if it's just part of the way that we want to be able to track, like Mervyn said, track what we're financing going forward. And we're developing at the moment an internal system so that we can actually track the financing that we're doing. I think that's turned out to be actually quite complex, because obviously you're financing lots of different things and they fall into different sectors. And then what buckets do they fall into? Environment, are they social, or do they in fact actually address both? So we're actually changing the systems within the bank as well to be prepared for, not only to meet the needs now, but to be prepared for the future, because we see this growing significantly, this sustainable financing.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. Simon, would you like to add something from an European perspective, how the banks are looking at some best practices in this segment?
Yeah, thanks. So the question, I think, because I saw the question in the Q&A as well, was very much about principles and practice, and seeing as the book's called Green and Sustainable Finance Principles and Practice, I feel I ought to opine on it a little bit. But I think that the good news as to what this means, in terms of the principles, it's not at one level highly complex. I mean, a green bond is, from a financial perspective, is more or less a bond. There's different types of bonds, of course, use of proceeds bonds and other things. A green loan is still a loan. We don't fundamentally need to develop a completely new understanding of finance in order to apply green finance. I suggest at the level of the principles, really the key here is to remember that when we're thinking about green finance, we're thinking about financial risks, plus, and sort of Mervyn talked about these in details, plus the climate risks, the physical and transition risks. And when we're talking about the return, we're talking about the financial return plus the impact return. So the environmental return or the social return we're seeking as well. And then, a green bond or a green loan simply tries to combine a financial return with an impact return. In the case of a green bond, it'll be an environmental return. In the case of a social bond, it'll be a social return. There are SDG linked bonds and sustainability bonds and sustainability linked bonds. And Belinda mentioned sort of blue bonds, which are slightly different earlier. Lots of these sort of areas, but the core financial details are pretty much the same. What it means, though, is we do need, as banking and financial professionals, either ourselves or through working with experts, to understand the impact side too, and that is where we do need to develop some new areas of knowledge and skill. When it comes to the practice, though, I think in terms of the climate risks, this is the area, I think Mervyn's touched on this quite rightly, where most attention is being focused now because of the risks that central banks and regulators see to financial stability caused by climate risks coming over the horizon ever more quickly. For me, the key point to understand here is that climate risk isn't a separate bucket of risk. These are cross-cutting transverse risks that impact on every other type of risk that financial institutions face. But again, that means it's not something completely new. We should be good at credit risk, we should be good at ops risk, we should be good at conduct risk, all these kind of things. But then it's how do we incorporate some of the physical and transition risks sort of into that. Just to give a very, very obvious example, think about a residential mortgage portfolio that a bank might hold. Many institutions would already be looking at flood risk, for instance, if a developer's building a couple of apartment blocks right next to the seafront or near a river that's liable to flooding, things like that. That's an example of physical risk. We just need to extrapolate this. So it's not something we haven't been doing, but we need to do that right across the portfolios of risk. Perhaps the most difficult part, though, which we've touched on, is then how we assess the risks right across our investment or credit portfolios, and this is where a lot of effort is going to. So Belinda's just touched on this. There are approaches out there, we won't go into the detail, I suspect today, called things like PACTA, the Paris Alignment Transition Capital Assessment, and science-based targets, and PCAF, and these are all sort of methodologies and ways in which we can try to identify not just the risks of the risks and the emissions that come directly from banks' own operations, but far more importantly from the emissions in banks' lending and investment, or banks' lending and investors' investment portfolios, what we call the financed emissions. And that's where the critical work needs to take place, because that's where financial institutions face the really big climate risks. So that's the area we need to look at. And then in terms of practice, then what we need to do is we need to really quite radically upskill and reskill finance professionals so they have a clear understanding of climate risk. And not that we don't all need to become climate science experts. We don't all need to become the next David Attenboroughs. But as bankers, we have a key role to play to advise the companies we work with on their own transition plans. It's a great opportunity for bankers to be trusted advisors to their customers and clients. And we need to be able to work with a range of experts, environmental experts, who are able to help us with the impact analysis. And we have to have enough knowledge to be able to apply some professional skepticism, some professional judgment to this. So Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of England, he's now the UN Special Envoy for Climate Finance, leading all the UN's work on green and sustainable finance, head of the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow in November. He has a great phrase about it. So he says, the objective we are trying to achieve, and this is the objective for finance, is that every professional financial decision should include climate change. Whether that's looking at opportunity, whether that's looking at risk, every professional financial decision. Logically, that means, therefore, that every finance professional needs to at least have a basic understanding of climate change, green and sustainable finance at a level that's appropriate for their the role they have, the organization they work in, and so on. So that's the challenge I would suggest for all of us. We all need to upskill ourselves in this area. And of course, it's fantastic that we have over 100 people joining us this morning who are starting to do just that.
Thank you, Simon, for that. I think it's a very, very interesting discussion that we just had. It's about, understanding the impact. It's about, reorienting your, perspectives. It's about building new knowledge areas. I think there's a lot to be done when it comes to this area of green and sustainable finance. So thank you for those answers. I'm literally flooded with questions. I've got probably 21 questions in my Q&A. I'm not sure if we have enough time to do that. So probably from my side, let me ask my last question before I start taking the questions. So you looked at banking, we've looked at the principles and practice of green finance. And I think it's very important for us to look at the investing perspective as well. I think in May, just last month, Germany issued a 30-year-long green bond. And it seems it had a yield, which is 2 pips or 2 basis points lower than the traditional conventional bond. So how is this concept of ESG investing evolving, especially from 2 dimensions? One from a credit perspective, looking at bonds as an investment option, and secondly, when it comes to equity investing, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of buzz about whether ESG makes sense. Should investors invest in ESG funds? A lot of funds are being earmarked globally for ESG investing. So how is it that the equity investing with an ESG perspective, ESG angle to it, how is it going to help investors? So probably I think I can start with Mervyn, because he works closely with the rating firm's perspective about investing. So Mervyn, please, thanks.
Yes, happy to tackle this question. And I think the question, does ESG investing make sense? When a lot of people hear that question, they're basically asking, oh, if I invest in an ESG strategy or ESG fund, will I earn a higher return or lower risk? And I think that's way too simple a question. I think if you switch the question to, does ESG analysis make sense for an investment firm, then it would absolutely make sense, because these issues are becoming more and more material and they have to be considered. It's the same way as if I asked you, does financial analysis make sense for investing? You would, of course, say yes, right? Because I mean, that's the same way of kind of thinking about, does ESG analysis make sense? But when it comes to risk and return, then there's a pricing element, right? Because you could have something that is a fantastic opportunity and lower risk, but if the pricing has gone to a point where it's too expensive, you're not going to get that risk and return. So that's where the analysis come in. Okay, and so what has changed with ESG investing, I think, is, like I mentioned, this switch from externalities to those externalities being internalized into financial impacts and cash flow impacts. And so the fact that these regulations are coming through, the fact that consumers are changing their behavior from a sustainability perspective, the way that financial institutions are changing the way they lend, all have investment implications. Now, I think what a lot of people would have said so far is that a lot of ESG externalities, be they environmental or social, probably weren't well captured in pricing in the markets, because when I say that something like carbon in terms of externality, there was no carbon pricing scheme really kind of decades ago to kind of really turn it into a financial a financial impact. And so that's changing, and I think we're seeing investors paying much more attention from an ESG much more attention to ESG issues to be able to price these potential risks and impact accordingly. I think on the other side of this is, I think, again, I mentioned ESG investing, depending on which investor you're talking to, isn't purely about risk and return. So there's some investors who want to also want to have a sustainability or impact preference alongside what they're looking for from a risk return objective. And so a clear marking of what's green and not green, what the potential social impacts are, how your portfolio is aligned from a carbon footprint or SDGs perspective, adds to the range of options that an investor is able to use to be able to actually articulate and implement their broader investment preferences. And so again, then whether it makes sense or not, it's not purely a risk return question. It's how well does it fit the overall objectives of the investor. I think both of those sides, we are seeing kind of more and more options for investors to be able to articulate their ESG strategies.
Thank you, Mervyn. Simon or Belinda, would you like to add on any perspectives about this? Please go ahead.
Simon, would you like to take that one?
Please go ahead. We can hear you. Belinda, I think there's some issue with your sound.
Shall I, Alan, shall I?
I think Simon, please, yeah.
Well, Belinda, I hope Belinda can join us soon. I think, Mervyn, I think that's a fantastic overview of the area. Thanks for that. I would just maybe add two points that I think are key. I mean, one is, look at what some of the big long-term institutional investors are doing. So the big life insurers, the pension funds, and so on. Their investment horizons have to be, in terms of 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and so on. And they are quite clearly pricing in climate change, climate risk, looking at the opportunities from climate resilient infrastructure and development and so on, because they have to in order to generate the returns over the long term. And where they go, often the rest of the market will follow. I think that's one important shift. And also particularly in Europe and the US, but also in China, we're seeing a very significant shift in private wealth to being held by a majority of female investors. I think in the US, I saw a figure that within 10 years, the great majority of wealth will be owned in the US by female investors, because women tend to live longer than their husbands. So there's a kind of transfer going on there for just one reason. And of course, we've got the shift to millennials as well, who are now becoming increasingly wealthier. I know it can be a little bit overblown, and people say, well, young people will invest in green things and then people change when they're older. But there is, compelling evidence, certainly in the US and Europe, that individuals' investment preferences sort of are changing. So both on the retail investment side and on the institutional investment side, I think we're seeing some really interesting shifts, which then support the reasons that Mervyn put forward as to why kind of ESG investing isn't something completely new and completely different. It's a shift rather than something new we've just invented.
Thank you. For a lot of people, their ESG investing is all about Tesla. So I think there's a huge world beyond Tesla when it comes to, looking at the whole gamut of, ESG investing. And I think from what our panelists just told us, it's a way of investing, and probably going ahead, there'll be a lot of interested investors who are ready to put the funds on the table, given the opportunities and challenges that's in the segment.
Alan, just a quick point on Tesla. So I live in Edinburgh, and people may not know, but what was the largest private investor in Tesla after Elon Musk himself was the Scottish Mortgage Trust, which is run by Baillie Gifford, a big investment firm based in Edinburgh, and they were very, very early investors in Tesla, as with lots of other companies, I don't know all the details, but they were sort of struck by the thesis that Elon Musk and others had in the very early days, that they're not building a car company. This is a play on a changing world. Very interestingly, they've now, I believe, sold down most of their holdings in Tesla, and they don't think it's got much further to go. Should have to put on all the user caveats. I'm not, I can't give investment advice, so shares can go up and down, all these kind of things. But Tesla is the poster child. But just think of all the other sort of interesting clean tech sectors out there, whether it's sort of batteries, whether it's renewables. Just one just has to think about all the things we need to change to move from a high carbon world to a low carbon world, and then all the components that go into a Tesla, or all the components that go into an offshore wind farm and things like this. It really is a lot of exciting technology out there. And as I said earlier, we've invented all the things we need to change the world. We just need to deploy the capital into them so we can build them out at scale. I think one of the really interesting areas to look at is going to be kind of carbon capture and storage at scale, and hydrogen will be the other area I think well worth looking at.
Thank you for that. I think Simon just gave us a lot of investment ideas. So clean tech, the entire ecosystem, around clean tech, from the battery makers to the raw materials for the batteries. So I think there's a lot of investment opportunities in the entire segment, and it's up for the investors to use it for their advantage. If I may just take a question, which is basically something that a lot of people have asked. It's a common running theme. So Kumaraswamy has asked that question, Mason has asked, Mohammed has asked. So an overarching theme is, how are regulators looking at the green and sustainable practices going ahead? So is it going to be something like that's optional, that what a lot of banks do, a lot of financial institutions do now? It's good to have. Or going ahead, do you think the regulators all around the world, probably even a Basel committee itself, would come with some sort of a guideline as to every single bank should do this? Going back to Mervin's point that the green asset ratio has already come in place in Europe. So how do you see the regulatory angle evolving when it comes to the whole gamut of sustainability? Is it going to be very different post-COVID? Is every regulator going to take this up very seriously and ask the banks and finance institutions probably go by the rule rather than just go by an option? Would be glad to hear the perspectives about this. Anyone? Thank you.
Okay, happy to start that one. So again, when we talk about sustainable finance regulation, we're talking about a huge amount of things happening at the moment. And so we have taxonomies, we have disclosure requirements, we have prudential regulation when it comes to central banks. There's a lot of different things happening, and they are all related, but often with different objectives. So when we're seeing climate stress tests and the potential for prudential requirement changes for banks, that's a much more risk-focused assessment, right? It's not about trying to build the sustainable finance architecture. It's about getting banks to consider things from a risk perspective and potentially manage the financial instability or financial stability challenges that climate change may face. But then you also have a lot of things which are aimed at the development of the sustainable finance architecture. So I would say something like the EU taxonomy, or there's taxonomies that are being developed all across the world, which is aimed at defining what a sustainable activity is, so that there's a clear idea when the sustainable finance architecture develops, what can be considered exactly a green bond or not a green bond, what is sustainable and what is not sustainable. And so all of that is designed to ease the path of the creation of the green and sustainable finance system. And we're seeing this kind of across the world. And I think the taxonomy is going to be one of the things that are going to be developed that we're going to see everywhere, as well as coordination globally. So we've seen the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, 17 jurisdictions which are looking for common ground on taxonomies. Beyond the taxonomy, though, the taxonomy is being used to inform various other regulations. So in the EU Strategic Action Plan, there is the use of the taxonomy to then develop things like the Green Bond Standard, which is, okay, now that we've defined what a green bond is in terms of what it can finance, what else do we need to define? What do we need to be an exact use of proceeds percentage? Like how much proceeds should be used for working capital? Or what is the reporting requirement? That sort of regulation is also coming through, which is helping to form the architecture. The other branch of sustainable finance regulation, I would say, is disclosure, which is to allow private actors and others to be able to act on some kind of sustainability objective or even a risk assessment objective. So I think green asset ratio can be one of those, which is like, okay, how sustainable is this bank's activities? What exactly are they investing that is sustainable? What are they investing in that is not sustainable? So if I am an investor, I'm able to say, oh, you know what, I don't want to invest in banks which have a significant portfolio in coal. There is this additional information for me to act on. And then I think with all this stuff, you also are seeing the potential for government incentive mechanisms to be set out. So be it the potential green asset purchases, maybe it could be a change in terms of the capital treatment, or kind of various policies that are being discussed, which is, can we use the created sustainable finance architecture to direct lending? So there's a huge amount of things happening, and I think we're going to see different speeds on different strands across the world, but the overall direction is that there will be more rules and regulations coming through.
Sure. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
I think
Alan, I think that's a fantastic summary from Mervyn. I sort of commend that to everybody. The only bit I'd add to that is, everybody, please watch for what a body called the Network for Greening the Financial System is doing. So the network is, I think there's about 80 members now. Effectively, it's the central banks and financial regulators who've come together to look at this. And I believe the Abu Dhabi financial regulators are certainly members of that, and we're not going to see global regulation, because that doesn't happen anyway in any area of banking, and we like to think it does, but there are lots of regional and national variations. But what we are already seeing is increasing coordination and harmonization of regulatory approaches, whether that is through disclosure, whether it is through taxonomies. So China and the EU have something called the common ground approach. So there's an alignment of taxonomies there. There's a lot of different sustainability standards and standards for carbon accounting out there, and through the IFRS Foundation, there are now moves to try and bring those together. And again, will we have a single set of sustainability reporting standards? Well, no, we won't. But we don't have a single set of financial reporting standards, because the US do their own thing and others do their own thing. But there'll be a harmonization around that too. So we are definitely seeing a direction of common regulatory travel. Yes, some countries will move at different speeds, but I think the direction and the destination is clear. But please take a look at what the Network for Greening the Financial System are doing, because that does bring it all together in one place.
Sure. Thank you for that. I think we'll take a very interesting question, which is again something many people have asked. So looking at the UAE perspective of how the green and sustainable finance and regulation and all is evolving, I think there's a lot to do in this segment, and UAE is probably a leader when it comes to many of these areas. So Belinda, if you can actually share some of the work being done in UAE, especially from a banking perspective and also from a regulatory angle, that would be great. I hope you can.
Sorry, I had a bit of a problem with my tech. Yeah, interesting developments in the UAE. There was the UAE Sustainable Finance Framework that came out recently, quite high level at the moment, but I think that there'll be more work that's done on that. That was a collaboration between the Ministry of Climate Change and Abu Dhabi Global Markets. There's the Abu Dhabi Sustainable Finance Declaration and the Dubai Sustainable Finance Declaration. A lot of banks have signed up to that. And as I mentioned before, we see that central bank may be issuing some questionnaires on sustainable finance perhaps this year, with maybe some voluntary disclosure next year. ESCA have, I believe, are working on developing a taxonomy, and they are now requiring, as ADX also listed companies, to report and disclose, and ESCA are requiring banks to make sure that when they are issuing their disclosure, that it's also in Arabic. I think that the challenge continues to be, as both Simon and Mervyn have said, is that there isn't one framework that can be used to assess properly at the moment or do comparisons between performance. But with taxonomies and the development of TCFD and certain things, I think that the aim is to bring a sort of alignment. But I think that one of the challenges, and just to go beyond the UAE, is if you're a UAE-based bank, and I think that this is something that we all need to take into consideration, is if we're a UAE-based bank, but we're also we have activities in different jurisdictions. So, for example, we have in London, then obviously we've got to meet the Prudential Regulatory Authority requirements on disclosure and planning around climate change and things. So I think that the question we have to ask ourselves is how do we meet those the requirements that are in markets that are more advanced than us, whilst also trying to bring our home market and our home activities up to meet those standards. And I think that these are questions that we do need to be asking ourselves, is if we're only going to respond in London, but we're not actually going to embed this, you know, at the head office level across a group, and I'm not just talking about FAB, but any bank that has multi-jurisdictional business, then, you know, how do we set that? So equally, we are also members of the Green Investment Principles for the Belt and Road to sort of understand what's going on in Hong Kong and China and everything, and how that all from UK, from China, how it all feeds in, and then how do we actually grow that in our home market to actually meet across all of those needs, to try and align the business. So I think that that's something that banks here need to be looking at as well.
Okay, thank you, Belinda. And it's great to know that so many things are happening here from the side of the banks, from regulatory perspective. Happy to know that Sky and the Central Bank of UAE is actually actively exploring this domain. So I think that was a lot of information for all of us. Let me go into another question here. There are a few questions on this theme about climate risk and the carbon accounting. So I think Mervyn and Simon can probably enlighten the audience about that. So how is carbon accounting and carbon financing? How is it actually going to happen, and what's the way ahead? I think Mervyn had an initial discussion just about the value of the carbon credits. So if you may just add on, that'll be great. Thank you.
Maybe I'll add a little bit, and yes, Simon can expand. I think we are seeing a huge amount of regulations coming through on carbon. It can either come in the form of carbon emission trading system, or sometimes you have things like carbon taxes. I think the main difference between a carbon pricing scheme and a carbon taxation scheme is carbon taxation schemes would be applied directly to the emitter, whereas the carbon pricing schemes allows for trading of allowances. So effectively, you get the abatement of carbon emissions potentially be directed towards the lowest cost abatement, as opposed to just putting the taxes on whoever the emitter is. And so we're seeing both carbon pricing and carbon taxation appearing and developing across the world. Now, carbon pricing scheme, there are a lot of different aspects to a carbon pricing scheme that affects how much of an impact it has. So sector coverage is an important one. So a lot of carbon pricing scheme starts off on the power sector. So that's what we're seeing in China. But there's a lot of plans, like as we've seen in the EU, where the emission trading scheme expands. So to aviation, or often domestic aviation, because there's a separate global aviation scheme, industry, stuff like steel, steel making, fertilizer, cement, transportation. There's kind of the carbon pricing scheme will have a sector coverage, of which usually starts with power and expands. Then there is the kind of different mechanisms of how you actually allocate the number of allowances. So quite often it's the number of allowances is decided by the government, and then how it's traded. It could be how it's distributed. It could be free allowances, which are given to the emitters, or it could be an auction mechanism. So like you auction at a particular price. And so all of this stuff can affect the supply and demand of a carbon pricing scheme. And so what we've seen in Europe is you started off with kind of, just the power sector, then the sector expanded. Then it went from a lot of free allowances to an auction mechanism, and then the supply of allowances declined so that the overall carbon price has gone up. And so all of this just kind of shows that the carbon pricing mechanism can be quite complicated, and quite a lot of infrastructure has to be created before you can have that kind of ultimate functional impact to impose a cost on carbon. I think one of the things that is going to change is that there's going to be multiple global carbon pricing schemes now. And so a few things that are still kind of being discussed is what are the role of carbon offsets? So there's a lot of discussions on scaling the carbon offset market in terms of both voluntary offsets as well as the use of offsets for these carbon pricing schemes directly, where can a EU entity buy an emerging market afforestation project to offset my carbon emissions in a regulatory scheme? Very complicated discussion. I think there's some proponents of it which argue, you know what, this is going to help reduce the global carbon emissions in a more cost-effective way. Some would argue that this affects the political impetus because it means that countries that don't want to set stringent carbon emission targets use offsets as a way to alleviate the actual amount of carbon decarbonization actually happening. There's also conversations about, when we're talking about carbon pricing schemes, how do we deal with the global trade impact? So in the EU, we're starting to talk about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a concern that the fact that there's tighter regulations in Europe is potentially going to lead to a negative competitiveness impact for EU tradable entities. So steelmakers would be the most obvious examples. How would the EU emission trading system affect the competitiveness versus Chinese, Japanese, and other steelmakers? And so the cross-border adjustments are a way to think about how to manage these carbon leakages. So that doesn't really, that kind of throws out a lot of things there, but I think maybe the summing up the answer to the question is that there's a lot of very complicated things happening with carbon emission mechanisms and schemes to put this price on carbon.
Yeah, and there's another, you're right, it is a hugely kind of complex area. I think one of the things I encourage people to keep in their mind, though, is that, you know, generally the global direction is that carbon pricing is increasing. You know, but I think you mentioned earlier that, you know, the current sort of EU carbon price is roughly around sort of 50 euros a ton. So the IMF, I think a couple of years ago, they calculated that for the world to achieve a below two degrees scenario by 2050, we needed to have, you know, consistent global carbon pricing of $75 per ton by 2030. And another useful data point is that the Bank of England in their exploratory scenario, so they're asking financial institutions to predict the impacts of climate change on their portfolios. They are using an assumption that by 2030, global carbon pricing will be approximately $100 per ton. So, you know, that could be, you know, if any of these predictions do come to pass, that's quite a rapid transition to much higher rates. There's another aspect to carbon accounting too, though, the carbon pricing, but also when we talk about carbon accounting, we're often thinking about accounting for the emissions, particularly we talked about the financed emissions, so the emissions that come from the activities of banks and other financial institutions through our lending and investment portfolios. And that's a really important part of this, because we need to know just how much we are financing. Otherwise, we first of all can't understand the climate risks we face, and also we can't measure alignment of financial institutions individually and collectively with the global goals of keeping global warming below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. So it's hugely complex, but if you're interested in this area, have a look at something called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, which is a global coalition of, I think, close to 100 financial institutions, and they're trying to develop a harmonized approach to measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions associated with lending and investment activity, which is aligned with something called the GHG, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which covers emissions for all sectors, not just financial services. Basically, PCAF provides guidance to measure and report financed emissions in a consistent and comparable way in sort of, I think there's 6 areas, definitely includes listed equity, corporate bonds, project finance, commercial real estate, residential mortgages, and a couple of other areas. And the key here is to bring consistency to reporting so that regulators can understand and see where the systemic risks are, but also so that if we've got that consistency and comparability, sort of boards and investors can make much better informed decisions around capital allocation and strategy and so on than they can if everybody's reporting their emissions in a slightly different way.
Thank you for that. I think we're really running out of time. So, and I've got a lot of questions still unanswered. So what I can do is some of the very technical questions that I've got, I can probably direct it to the panelists post the event. So I can send it to them over email and I can connect to the person who's asked this question. So I think that's something we can do. Since we are just left with another just few minutes, I would like to, before I wrap up, I would just like to take the perspectives of Simon and Mervyn and everyone. He spoke about upskilling and reskilling, the finance professionals so that they're aware of this new area. So what's a way ahead for all of us? So if I think there was a student who asked this question, what should I pursue to ensure that I can have a career in this domain? So if you can just in 2 minutes, just give a quick overview of what can be done in terms of improving the knowledge areas, improving your certification credentials and all this in this area, so that we have a new breed of highly qualified, very focused, sustainable professionals who come in. So if you can share the global perspectives, and I think Mr. Simon and his Chartered Institute of Bankers has got a wonderful program. If you can just give a quick overview, that'll be great. Thank you.
Okay, well, very quickly. So the 2 points I'd make are, financial institutions individually and collectively are making some very ambitious commitments to achieve net zero by 2050 and very ambitious interim targets, often by 2030. To do that, they need to be equally ambitious, and we need to be equally ambitious globally about upskilling and reskilling. I mentioned the Carney test earlier. Every professional financial decision needs to include climate change. Therefore, every financial professional will need to have at least a basic understanding of climate change and sustainability in order to work in this area. But actually, this may surprise you. The sort of single piece of advice I would give is, obviously, if you're really passionate about this area, then do what Belinda's done and go off and find a really good postgraduate course or another provider who can really help you become a deep sustainability expert. But if you haven't got the time or you don't want to do that, focus on being a really good finance professional or a really good marketing professional, or whatever your specialism is. Because actually what the planet really needs are people with really strong finance skills who can apply those to help solve some of the world's greatest global challenges, whether that's in the short term, whether it's COVID and financing sort of vaccine rollout, or whether in the long term, it's about deploying the savings that exist and transforming those into the investable projects we need to generate not just financial return, but an impact return as well. So it isn't about having sustainability professionals and finance professionals. It's about having finance professionals who can see the world through a sustainable and green finance lens. Thank
you, Simon, for that. I think, we've reached the end of our discussion. I think it was a very enlightening discussion that we've had over the last 1.5 hours. The time went literally so fast. I looked at my watch and it's already 12:30. I've got the last minute here before I hand over the floor to Phoebe for the concluding part. I think I would like to thank all my panelists today for their wonderful, insightful remarks and thoughts that they shared with all of us. Thank you for taking your time out on a busy day to spend time with the professionals in UAE banking sector. And I'm sure this discussion has enlightened a lot of people to pursue this topic in detail. And I'm sure a lot of banks will be discussing these topics in greater detail in the years ahead. And I'm sure that EIBFS would like to take this discussion onward by introducing more specialized discussions, webinars, and certification programs in this domain. So happy to do that. So thank you all for your time, ladies and gentlemen. It was a pleasure, moderating this discussion. I would leave with this very insightful, Greek proverb, which I really read some time back, and I think it really struck my head. a society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they shall never sit. So it's got a great wisdom, in that remark. So I'm sure there's a lot of things that people like you and me need to do to ensure that the generation to come, have a nice world to live in, and we have a sustained, prosperity that happens, in the years and generations ahead. So thank you all. I would leave the floor to Phoebe. So thank you all for this opportunity, and thank you for joining us. Over to you, Phoebe.
Thank you, Dr. Alan, and thank you for all the panelists for taking time. And thank you, Mervyn. It is afternoon in Hong Kong. And thank you, Simon. It is early morning. You are starting the day. And thank you, Belinda, for joining us for this insightful discussion. I'd like to invite Dr. Neil, and we will have a group picture. That is basically, I will do a print screen so that I can use that in our social channel. So I like to have a beautiful smile from all of you in a moment, and I will pass over the thoughts to have the closing remarks to Dr. Neil. So I'm just saying 1, 2, 3. So if you can have a quick smile, it will be definitely helpful. And thanks everyone, all the participants, for joining us today, accepting our invite, joining us during your work schedule. And it was an honor to have all of you. So 1, 2, 3, thank you very much. And we have, I pass on to Dr. Neil. Dr. Neil, you are on mute.
Sorry, Phoebe, technology always catches me. Thank you very much for having the closing comments. Please allow me first of all to thank Alan. I think he led the panel tremendously. It was a very good discussion. Let me thank all the panelists for actually having their time available and discuss this. And then lastly, I want to thank all the people that joined the webinar. I think it's great to see people from all over the world joining the webinar. I think we all got left with some serious thought that we have to go and do. And hopefully we all can add something good to the world when it comes to climate change over the next period or two. From the EIBF side, Phoebe, thank you much for everything that you guys have done. Thanks for the guy and all the people in the back office. And please go forward and have a great weekend coming up shortly, but have fun. Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, take care. Yeah, we are closing.
Lovely to meet you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.